The chamber went quiet the moment I stood up, and I could feel 1,000 eyes from 100 different worlds locking onto me at once. My name is Elena Voss, and for 6 years I had been the sole voice of Earth inside the Galactic Council. 6 years of sitting in that circular hall beneath a ceiling made of shifting light, listening to delegates from older, larger, supposedly wiser civilizations decide what my species was allowed to do with its own future. That day, they had gone too far. The High Speaker, a tall being named Threl Vantik, with skin like polished stone and eyes that never seemed to blink, had just finished reading out the Council's ruling. Earth was to surrender its independent defense fleet for inspection. Every warship, every research station, every piece of technology developed outside of Council oversight was to be handed over within 30 days, or sanctions would follow, trade routes cut, diplomatic protection withdrawn. Earth would be, in their words, reminded of its place. I remember gripping the edge of my podium so hard my knuckles turned white. For 200 years, humanity had proven itself again and again. We had survived our own near destruction, rebuilt our home, reached out into the stars, and asked politely to be treated as equals. And for 200 years, the answer had always been the same. Not yet. Prove yourselves more. Wait. I looked around that chamber, at the delegates who had spent decades speaking about us like children who needed supervision, and something inside me that had been quiet for a long time finally stood up straight. Ambassador Voss, Threl Vantik said, his voice smooth and unbothered, do you accept the Council's terms on behalf of your people? I did not answer right away. I let the silence stretch, because I wanted every delegate in that room to feel it. I thought about my grandmother, who used to tell me stories of a world torn apart by war, and how humanity had still found a way to rebuild something better from the ashes. I thought about the scientists back home, who had spent their entire careers finding ways to protect our people without ever asking permission first. I thought about every insult wrapped in polite diplomatic language that I had swallowed for the sake of peace. No, I said, we do not. A murmur rolled through the chamber like a wave. Threl Vantik tilted his head, almost amused. Then you understand the consequences. I understand them completely, I said, and I made sure my voice carried to every corner of that hall, because this moment was being broadcast live across 1,000 worlds. Earth has spent 2 centuries asking this council for respect. We have asked nicely. We have waited patiently. We have followed rules that were never applied fairly to us in the first place. Today, we stop asking. I took a breath, and for the first time in 6 years, I felt no fear standing in that room. Effective immediately, Earth withdraws its membership from the Galactic Council. We will not surrender our fleet. We will not submit to inspection. We will not wait for anyone's permission to defend what belongs to us. From this moment forward, humanity stands on its own. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted over one another in a dozen different languages, some translated instantly by the devices in my ear, some too fast and furious to catch. Threl Vantik's calm expression finally cracked, just slightly, just enough for me to see something underneath it that looked almost like worry. You would isolate your entire species, he said. Over pride? No, I answered. Over respect. There's a difference, and maybe someday your council will understand it. I gathered the small stack of files in front of me, files that no longer mattered, rules that no longer applied to us, and I turned to walk toward the exit. Behind me, I heard the speaker call my name one more time, his voice rising with something close to alarm. I did not turn around. The doors of the council chamber were tall, carved from some dense alien wood that had probably crossed a dozen star systems to end up there. I pushed them open myself, refusing the ceremonial attendants who usually did it for visiting dignitaries. I wanted my own hands on those doors. I wanted to feel the moment. Outside, in the wide hall that connected the chamber to the transport bay, my aide, a young man named Nathan Cole, was waiting with a look of pure shock on his face. He had been watching the broadcast from a side room. "Ambassador," he said, his voice shaking slightly, did we just leave the council?" "We did," I said, and I kept walking. Do you have any idea what happens now? I stopped for just a moment, looking at him, then out through the massive viewport at the stars beyond, stars that no longer belonged to a council that had spent 2 centuries telling us we didn't belong among them. I have some idea, I said, but I think we're about to find out together. We reached the transport bay, where our small Earth shuttle sat waiting, dwarfed by the grand vessels of a dozen other species parked around it. As we boarded, I looked back one last time at the council building, its spires glowing faintly under an alien sky, and I felt something settle deep in my chest. Not fear, not doubt, relief. The shuttle doors sealed shut behind us, and as the engines began to hum to life, Nathan sat down across from me, still pale. "They're not going to let this go quietly," he said. "You know that." "I know," I said, watching the station shrink behind us, through the viewport as we pulled away. But quietly was never really an option, was it? Not for us. The stars stretched out ahead of us, endless and unclaimed, and somewhere far behind, I imagined the chamber still buzzing with shocked delegates, trying to understand what had just happened. For the first time in 200 years, humanity had walked out of a room instead of waiting to be invited to speak. And as our little shuttle turned toward home, toward Earth, toward whatever storm was surely gathering because of the words I had just spoken, I found myself smiling. Whatever came next, we would face it as we always had, on our own terms. The first thing I noticed when we returned to Earth was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the waiting kind. 3 weeks had passed since I stood in that chamber and told the Galactic Council exactly where they could put their ultimatum. In that time, the sky above our cities had grown quieter. Alien trade vessels that once drifted lazily through our orbital lanes, exchanging goods and technology, had vanished almost overnight. The Council had wasted no time cutting us off, just as they promised. I spent those first days in meetings that blurred together, sitting across from generals, scientists, and diplomats, all of us trying to answer the same impossible question. What happens to a species that just told the rest of the galaxy it didn't need them anymore? "We lose access to 70% of our imported resources," said a woman named Grace Bennett, head of Earth's Resource Council, during one particularly tense meeting in the underground command center beneath what used to be Geneva. "Rare metals, certain medical compounds, half our long-range fuel supply chains, all of it, gone within the month." "And the protection treaties?" someone asked from across the table. "Void," Grace said flatly. "Every species that signed a mutual defense pact with us through the Council is now legally forbidden from helping us. Some of them will probably ignore that. Most won't risk it." I remember looking around that room, at faces lined with worry, and feeling the weight of what I had done settle onto my shoulders like a physical thing. I had made this decision in a moment of righteous anger, standing in front of a broadcast that reached 1,000 worlds. But the real cost of it was going to be paid here, in quiet rooms like this one, by people who had never asked to be part of my grand gesture. And yet, when I walked through the streets that evening, something else caught my attention. Something I hadn't expected. People were not afraid, they were energized. I passed a group of young engineers outside a research facility, arguing loudly and passionately about redesigning fuel systems using materials we could mine ourselves instead of importing. I saw farmers' markets restocked overnight with local produce, since imported alien foods had grown so common that half our population had nearly forgotten what homegrown vegetables tasted like. I even overheard 2 teenagers on a train talking about joining the Fleet Academy early, inspired by what they called the walkout, as if it were already a piece of history instead of a crisis still unfolding. Humanity, it seemed, had been waiting a long time for permission to be itself again. Still, not everyone shared that optimism. A week later, I received word that a species called the Draven Collective, a militarized empire that had been kept in check for decades only by strict council law forbidding expansion into contested space, had begun moving ships toward one of our outer colonies. A place called New Harbor, a small mining settlement on the edge of human territory, home to just under 12,000 people. "They're testing us," said Daniel Frost, the commanding officer of our outer fleet, during an emergency briefing. His voice was steady, but I could see the tension in his jaw. Without the Council's protection treaties in place, they want to know if we'll fight back or fold. What's our readiness at New Harbor? I asked. Minimal, Daniel admitted. It's a mining colony, not a military outpost. A handful of defense drones, basic shield generators, nothing built to withstand a coordinated assault. I felt my stomach tighten. This was exactly the kind of moment I had feared when I stood in that chamber and made my declaration. Not the loss of trade routes or resources, but the possibility that ordinary people, miners and their families, might pay the price for a political stand I had made on their behalf. Send reinforcements, I said. From where? Daniel asked. Ambassador, our main fleet is still 3 days out at best speed. If the Draven push forward now, New Harbor won't have that kind of time. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. Around the table, others began speaking at once, offering suggestions, debating options, but I found myself thinking instead about something my grandmother used to say. She had survived hard times before I was born, and she always told me that humanity's greatest trick was never having enough of anything except the will to make do. What about the independent research vessels? I asked. The ones stationed near the asteroid belt for mineral surveys. Daniel frowned. Those aren't military ships. They're not equipped for combat. No, I said, an idea forming. But they're fast, and if what I've heard from our engineering divisions is true, some of those civilian ships have been quietly outfitted with defensive countermeasures we developed outside the Council's approved weapons list. Ever since the Council started restricting our military research 15 years ago, our engineers have been finding ways around those restrictions using civilian designations. The room went quiet. You're talking about the shadow programs, Daniel said slowly. I'm talking about doing whatever it takes to protect our people, I said. We've spent 2 centuries hiding what we were truly capable of because the Council demanded it. Maybe it's time some of that finally came out of the shadows. Daniel exchanged a look with Grace Bennett, and something passed between them, an understanding I wasn't fully part of yet. There's something you should know, Ambassador, Grace said carefully. Not everything we've built over the years was ever meant to stay secret forever. Some of it was designed exactly for a day like this one. I leaned forward. Then let's use it. Within hours, orders went out. The civilian research vessels near the asteroid belt, ships that on paper were nothing more than mining survey craft, began changing course toward New Harbor. I watched the tactical display in the command center as 3 of them broke formation and pushed their engines to speeds that no ordinary mining vessel should have been capable of reaching. Ambassador, Daniel said, watching the same display with an expression I couldn't quite read, I think you're about to see something the Council never let us show anyone. 2 days later, as the Draven fleet approached New Harbor, expecting an easy demonstration of force against an undefended colony, they found something waiting for them instead, something they clearly had not accounted for. I sat in the command center that night, watching the reports come in real time, my heart pounding with every update. The Draven ships, 3 heavy cruisers built for intimidation rather than genuine warfare against a prepared enemy, broke off their approach less than an hour after engaging. Reports indicated significant damage to 2 of their vessels and confusion among their commanders about the nature of the weapons systems they had encountered. New Harbor held. 12,000 miners and their families went to sleep that night, still safe in their homes, protected not by the grand fleets of a galactic council that had abandoned them, but by the quiet ingenuity of engineers who had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of moment, all without waiting for anyone's permission. I did not sleep much myself. I sat alone in my office long after the briefing ended, looking out at the night sky, thinking about how close we had come to disaster, and how much closer we might come again before this was over. But for the first time since I stood in that chamber and spoke the words that changed everything, I let myself believe we might actually survive what came next. Not because the galaxy had grown kinder, because we had never truly been as weak as they believed. The morning after New Harbor, I stood in a briefing room that felt different from every meeting before it. There was no panic in the air anymore. Instead, there was a kind of focused determination I had not seen in all my years serving as ambassador. Daniel Frost stood at the head of the table, a holographic display hovering above it showing the retreat pattern of the Draven fleet. Beside him stood a woman I had not met before, introduced simply as Olivia Hart, head of a research division I had never been given clearance to know about until that day. "Ambassador Voss," Daniel said, "given what happened at New Harbor, and given that this is likely only the beginning, we think it's time you understood exactly what we've been building while the Council thought it was keeping us in check." Olivia stepped forward, activating a new set of displays. What I saw took my breath away. For 15 years, ever since the Council imposed strict limits on human military research following what they called concerning technological growth, our scientists had not stopped innovating. They had simply stopped announcing it. Weapons research had been reclassified as agricultural technology. Advanced propulsion systems were labeled as mining equipment upgrades. Defensive shielding, originally developed for protecting deep space colonies from radiation, had quietly been adapted into something far more resilient than the Council ever knew. "We call it the Continuance Program," Olivia explained. "After the Council began restricting our development, a group of scientists and military strategists made the decision that humanity would never again be caught unprepared, regardless of what treaties said we were allowed to build. Everything you saw at New Harbor was just a small piece of it." I looked at the display, at ship designs and weapon systems more advanced than anything the Council had ever permitted us to develop openly, and felt a strange mixture of pride and unease. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. 15 years, Daniel said. "Maybe longer, depending on how you count the early groundwork. We never had the full picture ourselves until a few years ago, when the different research groups finally started coordinating under a unified command structure. And the Council never noticed." Olivia allowed herself a small, tired smile. The Council never looked very hard. They assumed a species restricted from official military development would simply comply. They underestimated how creative people become when told they cannot protect themselves through normal means. Over the following days, as tensions with the Draven Collective continued to simmer, I found myself deep inside facilities I never knew existed, watching demonstrations of technology that had been developed entirely outside Council oversight. Adaptive hull plating that could reconfigure itself mid-battle based on incoming threats. Communication systems capable of coordinating fleet movements faster than any Council-approved technology allowed. Small, fast interceptor ships disguised as civilian transports, capable of striking with precision before retreating into legitimate trade routes where they would never be suspected. It was not just weapons either. Olivia showed me research into sustainable agriculture systems capable of feeding our population without any imported resources at all, designed specifically for a scenario where trade routes were cut off entirely. She showed me medical research that had quietly solved supply chain vulnerabilities the Council had used for decades as leverage over smaller species, ensuring we would never again be dependent on anyone else for critical medicine. "We always knew this day might come," Daniel told me one evening as we walked together through one of the research facilities buried deep beneath the mountains outside what used to be Denver. "Maybe not exactly like this, not with you standing up in the middle of a Council session and walking out live in front of the entire galaxy, but we knew that someday humanity would have to stand on its own, whether by choice or by force. We just made sure that when that day came, we would not be caught helpless." I thought about all the years I had spent inside that Council chamber, swallowing insults, accepting restrictions, watching other species treat humanity like a promising but immature child. I had believed, in my own way, that we truly were as limited as they said, held back only by our own shortcomings. I had been wrong. We had been limited by choice, holding back our full potential because revealing it too soon might have provoked exactly the kind of confrontation we now found ourselves facing. But that restraint had never meant weakness. It had meant patience. The real test came 10 days later, when the Draven Collective, humiliated by their failure at New Harbor, and pressured by their own internal politics to demonstrate strength, launched a much larger assault. This time, they did not send 3 cruisers to intimidate a mining colony. They sent an entire battle group toward one of our larger settlements, a place called Meridian Station, home to nearly 200,000 people and serving as a critical hub for our outer colonies. I was in the command center when the reports came in, watching the tactical display fill with red markers representing incoming Draven vessels. 22 warships, far larger and more heavily armed than anything that had approached New Harbor. "This is a real invasion force," Daniel said grimly, studying the display. "They're not testing us anymore. They mean to take the station. Can we hold it?" I asked, my heart pounding. Olivia stepped forward, her expression calm despite the gravity of the moment. Meridian Station has been designated as a priority defense site under the Continuance Program for the last 8 years. It's not just a civilian outpost, Ambassador. It never was. Over the next several hours, I watched something unfold that I will never forget for the rest of my life. What appeared on Council records as ordinary civilian infrastructure revealed itself to be something far more formidable. Defense platforms, disguised as communication relays, activated across the station's perimeter. Automated systems, developed using artificial intelligence far more advanced than anything the Council had ever approved for civilian use, began coordinating a defense that adapted in real time to the Draven fleet's tactics. The battle lasted nearly 6 hours. I sat in that command center the entire time, watching updates scroll across the display, feeling every minute stretch into an eternity. Reports came in of Draven ships being disabled by weapons systems they clearly had no defense against, of station shields holding under sustained bombardment that should have overwhelmed a colony that size within the first hour. When it was over, 8 Draven warships had been destroyed. The remaining 14 retreated in what our tactical analysts described as complete disarray, their commanders apparently unable to comprehend how a supposedly undefended civilian station had inflicted such losses on a prepared military force. Meridian Station held. Not a single civilian life was lost. I remember standing in the command center as the final reports came through, feeling tears in my eyes that I did not try to hide. Around me, officers and scientists who had spent years building something in secret, never knowing if it would ever be needed, allowed themselves a moment of quiet celebration. Daniel turned to me, his expression a mixture of relief and something like vindication. "Ambassador," he said, "I think the galaxy just learned something important about us." "What's that?" I asked. "That we were never actually asking the Council for permission to be strong," he said. "We were asking for the chance to prove it, without anyone getting hurt in the process. They gave us that answer for 200 years. Now we've given them ours." I thought about the delegates in that chamber, about Threll Vantik's calm, condescending voice, telling me humanity needed to be reminded of its place. I wondered if he was watching the reports from Meridian Station right now, and what expression might be on his face. News of the battle spread quickly, not just through human networks but across the wider galaxy. I began receiving reports within days of other species, smaller powers who had long lived under the shadow of larger empires like the Draven Collective, reaching out through unofficial channels. Some wanted to understand what had truly happened at Meridian Station. Others wanted something more. They wanted to know if humanity might be willing to stand beside them, the way we had just proven we could stand on our own. I did not have an answer for them yet. But for the first time since I made the decision to walk out of that chamber, I finally understood the full weight and possibility of what we had started. We had not simply left the Council behind. We had shown the galaxy what happens when a species finally stops asking for permission to become everything it was always capable of being. The victory at Meridian Station did not come without cost, and I learned that lesson in the quietest, hardest way possible 3 days after the battle ended. I stood in a memorial hall that had been hastily arranged near the station's medical center, looking at a wall where names had already begun to appear. 47 names. Defense crew members who had died keeping those automated systems running under sustained attack, engineers who had stayed at their posts repairing critical damage during the fighting instead of evacuating when they had the chance, and a handful of civilian volunteers who had taken up emergency roles when the battle stretched longer than anyone expected. 47 people, out of 200,000, a number that officials kept calling a miracle, a testament to how well the continuance program had prepared us. But standing there, reading names beside ages, beside photographs of smiling faces that would never smile again, I could not think of it as a miracle. I could only think of it as a cost, one that I had set in motion the moment I stood up in that chamber and spoke words I could never take back. A woman approached me quietly as I stood there. She introduced herself as Claire Bishop, mother of one of the engineers who had died keeping the shield generators online during the final hour of the battle. "You're the ambassador," she said. It wasn't really a question. "I am," I said, bracing myself for anger, for grief, turned into blame, for anything she might need to say to me in that moment. Instead, she simply nodded, looking at the wall of names beside us. "My son believed in what you did," she said quietly. "He told me, the week before all this started, that he was tired of watching our people apologize for existing. He said if the council ever pushed us too far, he hoped someone would finally have the courage to push back." I felt my throat tighten. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "Don't be sorry," Claire said, turning to look at me directly. "Be certain. Make sure what he died for actually meant something. That's all I ask." I carried those words with me long after I left that memorial hall, back into meetings that had grown increasingly complicated as the days passed. The Draven Collective, humiliated twice now, had gone quiet, but our intelligence reports suggested they were regrouping rather than retreating for good. Meanwhile, something else was happening that I had not fully anticipated. The wider galaxy was reacting. Grace Bennett brought me the reports during a meeting in the Underground Command Center, her expression unusually animated for someone typically so measured. "Ambassador, we're receiving formal contact requests from 6 different species," she said, sliding a datapad across the table to me. "Some of them are small, minor players who've spent decades under council rule, feeling just as restricted as we did. Others are more significant. There's even interest from a species called the Kalan Assembly, a fairly influential trade power that has had disagreements with the Council for years over resource allocation policies." "What do they want?" I asked. "Different things," Grace said. "Some want trade agreements now that we're no longer bound by Council restrictions on independent commerce. Others are asking more directly whether Earth would consider some kind of mutual defense arrangement, entirely separate from the Council structure." I sat with that information for a long moment, thinking about everything that had happened since I walked out of that chamber. The Council, meanwhile, had not been silent either. Reports indicated growing unrest among smaller member species, some of whom apparently viewed Earth's defiance as an inspiration rather than a warning. Internal Council politics, always fragile beneath their unified public face, appeared to be fracturing in ways that hadn't been seen in generations. "There's something else," Daniel Frost added, joining the conversation. "We've received an unofficial message from within the Council itself. Someone close to Threll Vantic, requesting a private conversation with you, off the record." "What could they possibly want to discuss?" I asked. "I think," Daniel said carefully, "they want to know if there's still a path back." I thought about that possibility for the rest of that day, turning it over in my mind, as I walked through corridors filled with the quiet, determined energy of people who had spent the last month rebuilding an entire system of trade and defense from nothing. I thought about Claire Bishop's words, about making sure her son's sacrifice meant something real. Rejoining the Council on the same terms as before was never going to be an option, not after everything we had proven about ourselves. But I began to wonder if there might be a different kind of path forward, one that did not require choosing between total isolation and total submission. 2 days later, I agreed to the private conversation. It took place through a secure communication channel, no cameras, no broadcast, just myself and a council representative speaking candidly for the first time in longer than I could remember. The representative was not Threl Vantik himself, but a quieter, older delegate named Sarath Cole, someone who had always sat near the back of the council chamber and rarely spoke during official sessions. "Ambassador Voss," Sarath said, his voice carrying a tiredness I hadn't expected. "I imagine you're surprised to hear from me, rather than the High Speaker." "A little," I admitted. "What can I do for you?" "I want to be honest with you, since it seems your species values honesty more than most who sit in that chamber," Sarath said. "The Council is not as unified as it presents itself to be. Your departure, and everything that has followed since, has exposed disagreements many of us have held privately for a long time. There are member species who feel the Council's restrictions have always been more about maintaining control over smaller, developing civilizations than about any genuine concern for galactic stability." I listened carefully, saying nothing, letting him continue. "Your victories at New Harbor and Meridian Station have inspired some of those species to speak more openly about their frustrations," he continued. "Others are frightened, wondering what happens if more species follow your example and simply walk away. The Council, as it currently exists, may not survive this in its present form." "Is that a threat or a warning?" I asked. "Neither," Sarath said. "It's an offer of sorts. Some of us believe there is still value in cooperation between species, in shared knowledge and mutual defense, but structured very differently from how the current Council operates. Less restriction, more genuine partnership. I wanted to know if Earth might be interested in helping shape something like that, rather than simply standing entirely apart from galactic affairs." I thought carefully before answering, remembering everything that had happened over the past month, every cost we had paid, every lesson we had learned about our own capabilities. "I'll consider it," I said honestly, "but understand this. Earth will never again accept a structure where our worth is measured by someone else's permission. Any future cooperation has to start from a place of genuine equality, not tolerance." "I understand," Sarath said quietly. "I believe many of us do now, in ways we didn't before." When the conversation ended, I sat alone for a long time, thinking about what kind of future might still be possible. Not a return to the old Council, and not permanent isolation either, but something new, something we would help build rather than simply be granted. I thought about Claire Bishop's son, and about every person who had stood their ground at Meridian Station without waiting for anyone's approval to defend what mattered to them. Whatever came next, I promised myself it would be worth what we had already paid to get here. 6 months after I walked out of that chamber, I stood in a very different room, addressing a very different gathering. This was not the Galactic Council. This new assembly, still without an official name beyond the working title of the Coalition of Independent Worlds, met in a station humanity had built entirely on its own, orbiting quietly at the edge of what used to be considered contested space. Delegates from 11 different species sat around a table shaped not as a circle meant to imply equal but distant participation, but as a long, open table where everyone could see each other's faces clearly. Among them sat representatives from smaller species who had spent decades under the shadow of larger council powers, finally given a genuine voice in decisions that affected their futures. The Kalan Assembly had joined formally 2 months earlier, followed by several other trade powers who had grown tired of council restrictions that always seemed to favor older, more established species over newer ones. I looked around that table and felt something I had never quite felt during all my years serving in the old council chamber. Not tolerance, not patience, genuine respect, built not on tradition or hierarchy, but on demonstrated trust between equals, who had chosen to stand together rather than being told they must. Sarath Cole sat among the delegates as well, no longer representing the old council, but rather a growing faction of former member species who had left to join this new structure entirely. The old Galactic Council still existed, technically, but its influence had shrunk considerably over those 6 months, as more species reconsidered where their loyalties truly belonged. Threl Vantik, I had heard through various channels, was still the high speaker of what remained of the council, though reports suggested his position had grown increasingly difficult to maintain as member species continued to question decisions that had once gone unchallenged for generations. "Ambassador Voss," said a delegate from a species called the Tauran Concord, one of the newer additions to our coalition, "your engineers have made remarkable progress on the shared defense network we discussed last cycle. I understand testing exceeded expectations." "It did," I said, allowing myself a small smile. "Though I should clarify, it's no longer just our engineers. Your scientists contributed significant improvements to the shielding technology. This coalition works precisely because we're building things together now, not simply sharing what one species decides to allow another to have." There was a murmur of agreement around the table, and I felt a warmth in that moment that reminded me exactly why the past 6 months, despite everything they had cost us, had been worth it. The Draven Collective had not attacked again since Meridian Station. Reports suggested significant internal turmoil within their leadership following their humiliating defeats, and more recently, quiet negotiations had begun between Draven representatives and our new coalition, exploring the possibility of the collective joining as a member rather than remaining an outside threat. I did not know yet whether that would happen, but the fact that it was even being discussed spoke volumes about how much had changed. After the meeting concluded, I found myself standing alone near a wide viewport overlooking the stars, much as I had on the day I first walked out of the old council chamber. Nathan Cole approached quietly, no longer the nervous young aide who had questioned my decision that day, but someone who had grown into a confident diplomat in his own right over these past months. "You seem thoughtful, Ambassador," he said. "Just remembering," I said. 6 months ago I stood in a room very much like this one, except everyone in it believed humanity belonged somewhere near the bottom of a very long list of species that mattered. Now look at us. "Do you regret it?" Nathan asked. "Any of it?" I thought about that question seriously before answering. I thought about the 47 names on that memorial wall at Meridian Station, about Claire Bishop's quiet request that her son's sacrifice means something real. I thought about every sleepless night since that first decision, every difficult choice that had followed. "I regret the cost," I said honestly. "I will always regret that. But I don't regret the decision itself. We spent 2 centuries asking a council that never truly respected us for permission to matter. All it took was finally refusing to ask anymore." Nathan smiled. "My grandfather used to say something similar, actually, about how humanity's greatest strength was never really our technology or our numbers. It was always our stubbornness, our refusal to accept limits that other people tried to place on us." "Sounds like a wise man," I said. "He'd have liked seeing this," Nathan said, gesturing toward the coalition station around us, toward the delegates from a dozen worlds now working together as genuine partners rather than as ranked members of an old hierarchy. All of it. I looked out at the stars again, thinking about how different this view felt now compared to that day 6 months earlier, when I had walked away from a chamber that told me humanity would always need someone else's approval to matter. We had proven them wrong, not through arrogance or aggression, but through quiet preparation, genuine courage, and an unshakable belief that respect could never truly be granted by someone else. It had to be claimed, and defended, and built through actions rather than requested through words. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected message. Threll Vantik himself, the same high speaker who had once told me humanity needed reminding of its place, requested a formal meeting, not to discuss sanctions or ultimatums this time, but to explore what he called a new understanding between the remaining Galactic Council and our growing coalition. I agreed to meet him, this time in person, aboard our own station rather than within the old council chamber. When he arrived, I noticed something different about him immediately. The calm condescension that had once defined every interaction between us was gone, replaced by something more careful, more measured. "Ambassador Voss," he said, "I imagine you never expected to see me requesting a conversation like this." 6 months ago, I certainly didn't, I said. "A lot has changed." "More than I think anyone anticipated," Threll admitted. The council I represent is not what it once was. Many species have left, as you well know. Those who remain are asking difficult questions about whether our old structures still serve any real purpose. What would you like from us exactly? I asked. Understanding, he said simply. And perhaps, someday, cooperation, though I understand that will need to be earned rather than assumed, this time. I thought about everything that had brought us to this moment, the anger I had felt, standing in that chamber 6 months earlier, the uncertainty of those first difficult weeks, the courage of people at New Harbor and Meridian Station who had stood their ground without waiting for anyone's permission, the grief of standing before a memorial wall, and the quiet strength of a mother who simply asked that her son's sacrifice mean something real. I think that's possible, I said finally. But it starts from equality this time, Speaker Vantic. Not tolerance, not permission. Equality, earned through mutual respect, or not at all. Threll Vantic nodded slowly, something in his expression that might have been, for the first time since I had known him, genuine humility. I believe, he said quietly, that is exactly the understanding we need to build. Later that evening, I stood once more at that wide viewport, looking out at the stars that stretched endlessly before us, no longer bound by anyone else's rules about where humanity was allowed to go or what we were permitted to become. I thought about my grandmother's stories of a species that had rebuilt itself from nothing more than once before, and I understood now, more clearly than ever, that we had done exactly that again. Not by waiting for someone else to grant us a seat at their table, but by building our own table entirely, one where every species who joined us did so as a genuine equal. The day Earth walked out of the Galactic Council had once felt to me like an ending, a dangerous, uncertain leap into the unknown that might have cost us everything we had worked so hard to build. Standing there now, 6 months later, surrounded by a new kind of future built on courage rather than permission, I finally understood what that day had truly been. It was never an ending at all. It was simply the moment everything changed forever, and humanity finally stepped into the place among the stars we had always been capable of claiming for ourselves.